So for our second video this week, we are going to be digging deeper into specific compliance strategies. But before we get to that, I want to just cap off our discussion of conformity. So you should have just watched a video that offers kind of a summary and recreation of the ASH conformity studies, that line judgment study, right? And there's just a couple of little additional details I wanted to add. So there are a couple things that could be easy to miss in that video, but are extremely important. One of these is that our desire to conform, right, to see that the majority of other people in a situation are doing something and fall in line to do that thing as well, that can be rooted in at least two potential functions. So it can be about fitting in. It can be about that discomfort of being the lone wolf, the last man standing, and a desire to just feel like part of the group. A concern that if you're not part of the group, that if you kind of go against the flow, people might like you less. And all of that desire to be liked and to fit in, that's what we would call normative influence in the case of conformity. So normative, social norms, what's normal, right? That's not the only reason that we might conform. We may also conform because we figure that other people might know something we don't know. So let's think about that ASH line study example. Some of the participants in that study, when they were being debriefed, they said the reason that I went along, even when I originally thought it was a different answer, I knew that everyone else was giving the wrong response. But I just kind of got tired of resisting. I got tired of always being the person who disagreed, and so I just gave in to save face. That would be normative influence. Other people would sometimes say, I started to doubt my own eyes. I actually thought that if the 6 people in front of me were all saying B, even though it looked like A to me, who am I to think that they all have bad eyesight, that I know better than them, right? So they're actually taking the other people's responses as valid information about the correct response, and they are conforming to that. That would be informational influence. And interestingly, one thing that makes us tend to rely on informational influence even more is when we're in situations that are ambiguous, uncertain, kind of hard to parse apart. So let's say with the ASH line study, the closer the two lines, the incorrect response and the correct response, were to each other, the more somebody might doubt his or herself, the more they might rely on conformity for that reason of informational influence. If you can't feel certain about your own judgments, you might as well go with what other people are saying, right? Couple other little details that I wanted to note. One is that the number of other people who were in that situation, the number of other people giving the incorrect response before you, really mattered. You don't tend to see strong conformity behavior when you have, for instance, just one other participant, one confederate working with the research team giving the wrong response. It doesn't seem to really happen with 2, but that number seems to shoot up as soon as you have 3 people giving the incorrect response in front of you. 3 somehow makes a group. 3 somehow makes a consensus, right? And from there, maybe the numbers go up a little bit when you have 5 people, 6 people, 7 people, but really not that much. It actually takes a fairly small number to create this sense of groupiness that creates a sense of social pressure. So conformity depends on the number of other people, but it doesn't take many. And finally, even one other person who goes against the crowd, even one other rebel who's coming before you who gives the correct response, or even an incorrect response that's just different from everyone else's incorrect response. It bursts that bubble, it totally eliminates the sense of pressure, and it eliminates the conformity effect. Finally, one thing that speaks to this difference between the normative pressure, wanting to fit in, and the informational influence, thinking that the other people actually might be right, if you make your choices in private, meaning there's no need to save face, no need to be concerned about likability. If you're writing down your responses on a piece of paper rather than reporting them verbally, conformity drops quite a bit. All right, so now that we have wrapped up that discussion of the ASH conformity studies, we are going to be digging into compliance. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot more varieties of what it means to comply than varieties of what social psychologists have looked at with conformity or even obedience. So remember that social influence can take lots of different forms, verges from things where it feels like there's less pressure to things where it feels like there's much clearer pressure from other people. And compliance falls in the middle of that spectrum. Not as subtle as conformity, not as overt as obedience. And so this is when you're actually changing your behavior in response to a clear request. Now, in social psych, we interpret this term request a little bit broadly. This would include things like advertising messages that are clearly encouraging you to purchase a particular product. This could include things like someone approaching you on the sidewalk and asking for a donation to Greenpeace or for you to sign a petition to get a politician on the ballot. Could also include your friend pressuring you to hang out even when you have a lot of homework. It can mean a lot of different things. And it turns out that the simple act of making a request of someone else is a lot more likely to yield a yes than you might think. So I'm going to be describing to you the results of a study that was conducted at the University of Waterloo. I think is really interesting. And what they did in this study is they asked regular college students, folks like you guys, to try to get other people to engage in mildly unethical behavior. And specifically, they targeted the unethical behavior of telling a white lie or mildly defacing some kind of public property. So in terms of telling white lies, this would mean something like approaching another person in the university commons or the cafeteria and saying, hey, will you just sign this form? I'm supposed to tell other students about a new course, but I really don't actually want to have to describe the course to people, so it really helped me out if you could just sign here on the bottom. So that's the white lie. The second thing was minor vandalism. So you approach someone in the cafeteria, in the commons, and you say, hey, I'm trying to play a prank on someone, but they know my handwriting. Will you just quickly write the word pickle in this page of this library book? So imagining both of those scenarios, I want you to imagine how you would feel if you were this participant, if you had to approach other people and ask them to do these slightly unethical things. In particular, pause for a moment and predict how many people you'd have to ask before you successfully got someone to say yes. How many people would you have to ask to lie for you that you had thoroughly explained a new course? How many people would you have to ask before you got someone to write the word pickle in the pages of a library book? Once you've got those predictions, move ahead. So, just to give you a sense of what this looked like, in the actual research article, they included a picture of one of their results. And so what they found is it tends to not actually be that hard to get someone to do something that seems a little shady. They had their study participants estimate how many people they thought they would have to talk to before they got a yes. With the white lies study, the participants estimated that this would be about 8.5 people. And it turns out that in reality, they only had to talk to about 4 before someone would say yes. In terms of vandalism, it's almost more dramatic. So people thought they'd have to talk to about 11 folks to get a yes. And in reality, on average, about 1 out of every 5 people said, sure, why not? Why is there this imbalance? Why do we think people are likely to say no, when in fact they're often quite likely to say yes, even for things that are kind of wrong? Well, the participants in the study actually thought that these things were unethical. So when they were interviewed, followed up, debriefed, they would ask questions like, God, shouldn't I be writing with a pencil in this book? I'm not sure if I should. Are you sure it's really a library book? But they were often too uncomfortable to actually say no. So it turns out even just the simple act of making a request of somebody else is often enough pressure to get compliance. But then there's also the flip side of the coin. We know that we don't always say yes to the requests that are made of us. And it turns out that clear requests can also sometimes irritate us. And this leads to a phenomenon called reactance. So I'm going to share a screenshot of a text conversation that a friend of mine, Gerald, shared with me. Gerald was getting pestered with text messages from the Michael Bloomberg campaign back in the Democratic primary. They said, unprompted, can we count on your support? And his response is a little bit snarky, right? Totally justified, but also a little bit snarky. And one of the things that this is really evidence of is the fact that requests can trigger this thing we call reactance, which is a desire to push back against other people's attempts to control us, to dictate our behavior. To share a personal example, this is actually taken from a bathroom in Kaufman Hall. These little paper signs were implemented at the very end of fall semester 2019. And somebody, I don't know who, put up this sign that said, please use the lever to dispense paper towels. They provided a pretty good justification, but I was thinking, I don't even know where this frickin' lever is, and you certainly aren't one to tell me how I should be getting my paper towels. So I continued on, just pulling on the paper, until maybe 5 days later, actually, I ended up jamming the paper towel dispenser myself, and realized that this was probably actually the right thing to do. But in the interim, right, I was feeling a sense of reactance. I was feeling a sense of, who are you to tell me what to do? So, this is where we come back to this idea that we're more likely to give into social influence if it fits with certain basic motives that we have. If somehow it appeals to our desire to be liked, if it appeals to our desire to make good logical decisions, if it appeals to our desire to be consistent or honor our commitments. And that extra motivation tends to get us over that hump of reactance. I'm going to be describing a series of different compliance techniques, a whole bunch of different things that if you do them, tends to make other people more likely to say yes. And we're going to be starting with the technique of reciprocity. This is the idea that if you do something nice for someone before you make a request of them, if you compliment someone and then ask them to sign your petition, if you give someone a free sample and then ask them if they'll buy a six-pack, that makes you more likely to say yes. Now, why is this? It's because reciprocity is actually a big governing norm in social interaction. You do something nice for me, I feel obligated to do something nice to you. So the person has done something nice, they've given me a gift, a compliment, a favor, and then they're making a request. They are offering up a really easy option for coming full circle and fulfilling that obligation of reciprocity. A good example of this, again, is free samples in the grocery store. I used to find it to be absolutely deadly to go into Whole Foods because they would always have these beautiful tables set up with free samples. Especially bad is when it would be wine, because of course I'm happy to taste 5 new varieties of Chenin Blanc. I go up, I start, throwing back sample cups, and then I go, oh shit, I probably need to buy a bottle, don't I? I didn't want to buy a $30 bottle of Chenin Blanc, but I end up doing it because I feel really indebted and I feel really on the hook, right? That's the norm of reciprocity in action. Now, keep in mind, the norm of reciprocity is really directly connected to our desire to be liked, to be likable. It makes us feel like jerks, meaning very unlikable, if someone does something nice for us and then we don't return the favor. So the next strategy we're going to be talking about is something called door in the face. And this is also about likability. It's about the idea that we do not like to repeatedly say no to somebody else. It makes us feel like we are mean, right? So how does this work? First, as the requester, you ask for something pretty unreasonable, something you know someone will say no to. So let's say you want your older sister to loan you some money to get some new shoes. You might first ask her for $150. She's supposed to pull $150 out of the money she's saved from her summer job. Of course, she's going to say no. But then you follow up. What about 25? And so because you've actually forced her to say no, you're kind of wearing her down and you make it more likely that she'll say yes to that slightly reasonable request of something like 25 bucks. It's also kind of related to the norm of reciprocity in the sense that by you backing down, kind of negotiating downwards, the other person feels like you're being reasonable and they want to be reasonable in exchange by saying yes. All right, another technique that's actually related, at least in part, to likability, and this is social validation. This is the idea that we are more likely to go along with requests when we also see other people doing that thing, liking that thing, or buying that thing. This is really important in advertising. So this would be some of the reasons that a company might impress on you the fact that lots and lots of other people are buying their product, right? Or, and this is actually from a real e-commerce store that I was on recently, those little notifications that pop up that tell you that someone has just purchased this product, someone has just purchased this product. It makes you feel like it's something that a typical person would like and desire, right? You see lots of other people doing it, it makes it seem more desirable. And this is an interesting one because we tend to go along with social validation partly because it makes us feel like we're part of the group, right? We want to go along with the crowd. And that's about fitting in. But it could also be, again, kind of like with conformity, kind of like with that Ash Line study. It could be because we think that other people probably know what's up. If Max from Denver thought that this was a reasonable product, if Max from Denver did his research and identified that this is the best parka or vacuum cleaner, well, maybe I should trust his judgment too. Maybe he's right. All right, now moving into a slightly different domain. Requests tend to have more oomph when they're backed up with testimony coming from experts or people with authority. So this would be like having a celebrity endorsement from someone who actually seems to have expertise in that domain, like Serena Williams telling you about her favorite tennis racket, right? Or this really classic trope that Oral-B toothpaste or Oral-B toothbrushes are recommended by 9 out of 10 dentists. Who are we to go against the expertise of a dentist? And this is really about wanting to be right. We trust the experts know what they're talking about, and so if they point us towards something, that's probably a correct and logical decision. Finally, we're going to talk about a set of things that I'm going to call commitment techniques. And these are different strategies for getting you on the hook, making you feel committed to a certain option, or making you feel like you've already put in investments toward that option. Kind of gets you locked in. We're going to be talking about 3 of these. They include foot in the door, low ball, and bait and switch. Because social psychologists are excellent at coming up with cutesy, jargony names for compliance techniques. Foot in the door is kind of like the opposite of door in the face. Instead of trying to get a no in order to later get a yes, you try to get a yes in order to get a later yes. You get your first yes by asking for something so small that somebody would have to be insane to say no. Like, can you give me 5 seconds of your time and sign this petition to protect baby pandas? Who doesn't like baby pandas, right? Problem is, you follow it up with a bigger or more costly request. Can you put a huge sign on your lawn saying you support Greenpeace? Or can we sign you up for a reoccurring monthly donation to Greenpeace, more likely? So, sign the petition and then follow it up with the lawn sign, right? Now, why would people be more likely to say yes in the second instance? Well, by signing the petition to say that you care about baby pandas, you have self-identified as somebody who values animal conservation, right? And then if you say, no, I'm not going to give my money to Greenpeace, you seem like you're hypocritical or inconsistent. And that's not a good look. All right, low ball. This is a different strategy for inducing a sense of commitment. This is when you offer to sell something at a low price or that somebody gets some benefit with not that much cost or commitment. Once the customer is interested, right? So let's say you're advertising a Toyota Prius instead of being 25 or 30K, you're actually offering it at 18K. The customer comes in to the car dealership, and then you say, oh my gosh, that was a typo. We didn't mean 18K, we meant 28K. Or it's 18K, but also you have to buy this upgrade, you have to pay for this insurance, it has to be XYZ, and the total costs end up coming to 25. So why would this work? This seems really sleazy and shady, right? Well, you've already gotten them in the door, right? The person took time off from their workday. They drove all the way to your car dealership. They've started imagining themselves driving home in a beautiful, fresh, new car smell Prius. And then that might make them primed and ready to just give in, cave in, and pay the extra money. Really similar is something called bait and switch. And this is, again, it starts with offering an excellent deal. Except instead of ratcheting up the price for the original product, you actually just take that original product away. Whoopsie daisy, we're sold out of Priuses today, but we can offer you a Corolla, right? And the Corolla is just its regular old price of $30,000. This can also be if you make the original product seem really unattractive. You offer a really cheap computer, the person comes into Best Buy, and then you say, oh man, it is cheap, but you don't really want that. The storage sucks, the CPU is terrible, the memory's awful, you should buy this mid-range model. That's a bait and switch. If you walk away with a different product than you thought you were going to get, that's a bait and switch. So, this is primarily, my head is blocking it, about wanting to feel consistent. So either because you don't want to look like a hypocrite, or because you've invested actual resources into the purchase and you don't want to lose those resources by backing out, right? Your time or maybe your emotional investment. So we stick with these commitments. We say consistent over time. All right, so here's where we're wrapping up. I want you to think about times where you actually try to convince people to do things. So if you wanted to convince a family member, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, to help buy you new shoes, which of these techniques might be the most helpful? Which of these techniques can you actually see yourselves using? One more example. If you wanted to convince a friend to sign a petition about a political cause you really care about, like you want to lower the speed limit in your residential street because there's been some accidents recently, what kind of strategies would you use? What's likely to be the most effective? The last thing you're going to be doing to wrap up this week is watching a video about the Milgram obedience studies. Many of you may be familiar with them, but I want you to pay particular attention to the factors that made people more or less likely to obey under these experimental conditions. All right, so that's it for this week, and I will see you in class. Bye, folks.